My wife asked to go to the special company party without me, and my response left her face pale and her eyes filled with guilt. I simply said, "If you have to go alone, maybe you're already too crowded." I didn't argue, just left the room and our story. That night, she went, and lost her way. Days later, I learned that her involvement with her coworker was nothing more than a whim for him. Alone, she tried to return, but it was too late. I had already found peace in the arms of a new love, someone who chooses me every day, even in my absence. When we met again, she apologized, crying over what she hadn't taken care of. I forgave her because I once loved her. Because what we had ended there. She was left with the regret, I with the freedom to start over. We remained separated. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing that ends so quietly is ever simple. The words she didn't say in that room, the way she looked away when I suggested she might already be too accompanied, the tremor in her hands as she picked up her purse, everything screamed the truth before it was spoken. That night marked me more powerfully than any other. Because I knew. I already knew. The betrayal had already happened, or was about to happen, and what hurt me wasn't the act itself, it was the choice. The choice to go alone. To not have me by her side. To not include me. To not fight. And the pain born of silent abandonment, of implicit substitution, is like a wound that bleeds unseen. I stood there, in that house, staring into the void, like someone watching a love affair rot in slow motion. Dinner growing cold, the wine opening its scent on its own, the porch light still on, as if I were waiting for someone who would never return. The party ended. She returned late, avoided eye contact, said she was tired. And I, foolish, in love, hurt, didn't ask anything. I didn't need to. Her silence screamed too loudly. And my pride, broken, only allowed me to say, "Sleep well." Because what else was there to say? In the following days, the abyss grew. Superficial words, automatic gestures, soulless kisses. She no longer touched me like before. It was as if there were a ghost between us, a third body in the bed, not breathing, but suffocating. Until one day, by accident, or punishment, I saw a message on her phone. It was short but direct. A sentence that changed everything, the night was unforgettable. And I knew. Not from the text, but from the response time, the frequency, the emojis that were once mine. And in that moment, what hurt me wasn't the sex, it was the exclusion. Being left behind by someone I swore to protect. Someone who watched me, day after day, trying to hold together a story she had already buried. I didn't fight. I didn't yell. I just left. I put on some clothes, got in the car, and drove aimlessly. I parked in front of the sea. I cried right there, like an abandoned child. Because deep down, I really was abandoned. And it wasn't by another man. It was by choice. She chose not to love me. He chose a new adrenaline rush over our routine. She chose to feel desired by someone outside, instead of reconnecting with the one who loved her inside, every day. And this kind of pain, the world doesn't see. It doesn't get ratings. It doesn't post on social media. It's a pain that hides in the bath, in the pillow, in the red eyes disguised as allergies. Days later, I learned it had all been fleeting. That her lover, so present and seductive, disappeared after getting what he wanted. He didn't answer anymore. He vanished. And she was alone. She tried to find me. She sent messages. She wrote long texts saying she'd made a mistake, that she'd gotten confused, that she still loved me. But when I read them, it all sounded like a delayed echo. It was like trying to put out a fire with a glass of water after the house had already burned to the ground. She cried in regret, and I understood. But she wouldn't come back. Because something inside me had died, not love, but trust. And when she left, she took the sweetest part of me with her. It was around that same time that, by one of those coincidences that only time can explain, I met someone else. Someone who wasn't part of my plans, but who fit into what was left of me with a frightening delicacy. She didn't come to heal. She came to welcome. She listened to me unhurriedly, touched me without fear, looked at me as if I were still worth loving. And that broke me. Because, after so much being treated as an afterthought, I finally became a priority in someone's eyes. And I resisted at first. Guilt suffocated me. How could I move on if the past still screamed? But little by little, I let go of the weight. One smile at a time. A new touch. A leisurely coffee. A walk with no destination. And I realized that I didn't need to forget to start over, I needed to accept that I was betrayed, yes. But that life, sometimes, pushes us from the abyss so that we learn to fly. Months later, we met again. By chance. In a small market. She was alone. No makeup. Her eyes were tired. She saw me from afar and froze. So did I. For a second, time stood still. There was pain in her eyes. There was something she wanted to say, but she didn't know how. Then she walked toward me, trembling. She apologized. She said that, the night of the party, she thought she was doing something for herself. That she deserved more. That she wanted to feel alive again. And then she realized she was just running away from herself, and she used our history as a shield. She looked me in the eyes and said, "You were my most." I listened to her. Calmly. Respectfully. Because I had once loved her. And those who truly love don't need to humiliate. She cried, and I felt sorry. Not arrogantly, but sadly. Because there was the woman I'd waited for so long, only too late. I wasn't the same anymore. Love had died, but I hadn't. I had survived. And by my side, now, was someone who chose me every day. No games. No doubts. No absences. But what she never knew, and perhaps never will, is that very night of the party, while she was getting ready for her adventure, I was downstairs, preparing something that could have changed everything. I had hired a band. The same one that had played our wedding song. We would have dinner at a restaurant reserved just for the two of us. And at the end, I would take her to the place where we met, with a new ring in my pocket. I planned to propose to her in a vow renewal. I believed there was still something to save. And maybe there was. But she never knew. Because she chose something else. She chose someone else. Another night. Another path. The band waited for hours on the sidewalk. The restaurant called me twice. And the ring stayed with me. For years. Kept in a box I never opened again. Until the day I gave the same box to another woman. Not with the ring inside. But with a letter. And inside it, I wrote, "Thank you for choosing me when I no longer knew if I deserved to be loved again." And there, in that simple gesture, I closed a cycle. And began another. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still wake up with the memory of the song playing alone somewhere in the past. And I wonder, if she had known what I was planning that night, would she have gone to the party? And maybe she asks herself that answer every time she sleeps alone. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize and we never support any kind of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but based on real emotions, and they all carry a single message: betrayal destroys what is most valuable between two people, trust. Get ready to dive into intense, exciting and, above all, captivating narratives. Unforgettable. Now, silence the world around you. Take a deep breath. You are about to hear a shocking story. Lucas met Isabella on an ordinary late afternoon, when the sun was already beginning to set behind the low buildings and the city noise faded to give way to the softer sounds of everyday life. It was in a discreet cafe, where she was reading a book, her cup already cold, her eyes immersed in words that seemed as distant as her own past. He watched her for minutes before approaching, more intrigued by the silence surrounding her than by her appearance. But there was something in the way she turned the pages with ease, as if each sentence had been written for her. Isabella wasn't a woman who drew attention wherever she went, but rather wherever she lingered. And that was what made Lucas stay. That day, they spoke little. A few glances, 2 or 3 loose sentences, and a shy smile that would, over time, transform into shelter. Lucas was an architect. He had a keen eye for detail and a mind that saw beauty even in blank walls. He was constantly searching for balance, proportion, and meaning in the forms he drew and the relationships he built. He was 33 when he met Isabella, and until then, he had experienced loves more passionate than profound, more noisy than lasting. But with her, everything seemed to blossom in silence. There was no urgency, no exaggerated promises, just a lightness that gradually transformed into commitment, routine, and then home. Isabella worked in marketing for a mid-sized company. She was intelligent, articulate, and extremely dedicated to her work. But outside of work, she retained an almost forgotten delicacy. She liked to write letters she never sent, photographed old windows, and kept a notebook where she listed all the places in the world she would like to visit, even if she had never left the country. They fell in love carefully. Their relationship was built on long conversations, home-cooked dinners, and short weekend getaways. There were no games, no empty spaces. Lucas admired the way Isabella treated those around her, with kindness, but without subservience. She enchanted him because she didn't need him, but chose him, day after day. And he did the same. Over time, plans came together. They rented an apartment together on a quiet street, with a balcony and natural light. They shared bills, closets, and secrets. It was a simple but happy life. Mornings began with freshly brewed coffee and shared laughter between sips. Nights ended with old movies and feet intertwined on the sofa. And even in the silences, there was comfort. Isabella was never one for emotional outbursts. She was more introspective, keeping a lot to herself, and Lucas knew this. He didn't demand constant demonstrations, but he knew her signals well. He knew when something was wrong, even if she said everything was fine. Sometimes she withdrew into herself, immersed in worries she didn't always share. And he, even frustrated at not being able to reach her in those moments, respected it. He trusted that, sooner or later, she would return. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were arguments, small, almost always about everyday trifles. Who left the wet towel on the bed, who forgot to pay the electricity bill, who spoke louder in a moment of fatigue. But they never went to bed angry. There was always reconciliation, and the certainty that they were in the same boat, rowing together. Over time, however, something subtle began to shift. And the most dangerous thing about silent changes is that they don't warn you when they arrive. Isabella began to seem more distant, too busy, too tired. Conversations lost some of their spark, and smiles seemed more polite than spontaneous. Lucas noticed this, but attributed it to work stress, the demands of the company, and tight deadlines. She kept saying she was going through a tough time, that deliveries were consuming all her energy. And he believed her. After all, he'd always believed in her. Trusted her. Loved her. And when you truly love someone, it's easier to close your eyes to small discomforts than to imagine that something more serious might be brewing. One night he prepared a special dinner. There was no special occasion, no particular reason. He simply wanted to do something different, to rekindle the connection he felt was fading. He cooked her favorite dish, lit candles, and played soft music in the background. When Isabella arrived, her face already had the expression of someone who didn't want to be there. She forced a smile, thanked him for the gesture, but said she was exhausted. She ate dinner in silence and spent the rest of the night in her room, claiming a headache. Lucas remained in the living room, staring at the dim candle flames. He felt foolish, childish, for having gotten his hopes up. But still, he refused to consider that the problem could be bigger than fatigue. Isabella, on the other hand, was immersed in an internal turmoil that even she couldn't understand. She was at a point where everything seemed heavy, repetitive, predictable. It wasn't that she didn't love Lucas, quite the opposite. She still saw him as a man of integrity, generous, and a companion. But something inside her cried out for change, for something new, something that would make her feel different. She found herself trapped between the comfort of a secure love and the restlessness that grew increasingly deep within her. She began to feel disconnected from herself, and with it, from him. She tried to hide it, tried to disguise it, but her gestures were no longer the same. The messages became shorter, the touches less frequent. And worst of all, she knew he noticed, but still, she couldn't stop what she felt. The atmosphere between them became quieter. There was still affection, there were still gestures of attention, but the sparkle in their eyes that had been there in the beginning, the one that made any small gesture seem magical, was slowly fading. Lucas started leaving work later, perhaps unconsciously avoiding the silences of the house. Isabella began dedicating more time to side projects, attending company events more frequently, and smiling more intensely in photos taken away from him. But even with all this, they still slept side by side. They still shared the same roof, the same bathroom, the same breakfast. Because not every breakup begins with an explosion, sometimes, it begins with silence. And that was the hardest part to face. Lucas wasn't naive. He knew something was off. But he wasn't paranoid either. He preferred to trust rather than question. He preferred to bet on what they'd built rather than give in to insecurities. He still made plans for the future. He saved money for a trip she'd always dreamed of. He thought about buying a bigger house, maybe a dog. He still saw a future. He still believed. As for Isabella, she found herself caught between guilt and the desire to escape. She wanted to rediscover the version of herself that existed before routine, before commitments, before predictability. But she didn't know how to do it without hurting the man who shared her days. And so she kept quiet. She slowly distanced herself, waiting for him to notice, perhaps even hoping he'd give up first, so the blame could be shared. The weeks passed, and that house, once full of life, now seemed to operate on automatic mode. The paintings on the wall, the plants on the porch, the books on the shelf, everything there testified to a love on pause. And even with all the distance, there were still traces of care. Lucas still remembered to stop by the market to buy her favorite chocolate. She still washed his shirts attentively, even if she didn't look him in the eye. There was, yes, an attempt to maintain appearance. But the essence, that was already beginning to crumble. It was at this point in the story that fate began to set the stage for what would come next. A succession of small decisions, chance encounters, absences that carried more weight than words. And then, an invitation, a special company party. An important event, attendance mandatory. Isabella talked about the party casually, but the way she looked at the floor as she spoke betrayed something more. She said it would be tiring, that it might not even be worth going. But days later, she confirmed her attendance. She chose her dress with more care than usual. She spent more time than usual getting ready. And when Lucas asked if she wanted him to accompany her, she hesitated. She said it was a more intimate, corporate affair, difficult for an outsider to fit into. And that's when everything changed. Right there, in that answer. In that moment when he understood that us was ceasing to exist. That she was choosing to go without him. That perhaps, she was already going with someone else. But what Isabella didn't know, and what none of them could have predicted, was that very night, Lucas had planned something. Something that could have changed the course of history. And that's precisely what she never knew. And perhaps what he did that night, without her knowing, is exactly the point where everything went wrong. On the Saturday of the party, the house dawned differently. The light seemed to filter in more cautiously through the windows, and the usual sound of synchronized footsteps in the kitchen gave way to long silences. Lucas woke first. He made coffee and prepared breakfast as he always did on weekends, but Isabella took longer than usual to appear. When she finally came down, her gaze was distracted, distant, as if she were already somewhere else. Their conversation was punctuated by automatic phrases, and even the "good morning" seemed mechanical. She briefly mentioned that she would be going out that evening to the company event, mentioning the names of colleagues Lucas barely knew. He listened without reacting, simply nodded and continued stirring the coffee. There was no longer room for direct confrontation. What would once have been an intense dialogue was now reduced to shallow exchanges. And it was in this void that doubt found a home. Isabella spent the afternoon getting ready with unusual zeal. She spent hours in front of the mirror, changing dresses, testing makeup, making short, discreet phone calls. Lucas said nothing. He watched from afar, like someone watching a movie whose ending they already know. But inside him, a part of him insisted on clinging to hope. Maybe it was just a phase. Maybe work was truly consuming what was left of her. Maybe that night would make her realize what they were losing. Sometimes he thought about everything they'd built together and wondered where exactly the solidity had begun to melt. No great tragedy, no abrupt breakup. Just the slow erosion of small choices, of unexplained absences, of unspoken words. When she came downstairs, ready, she was beautiful. Not the way she usually was at home-cooked dinners or in photos, smiling with her head resting on his shoulder. Her beauty was colder, more calculated, almost as if she'd been dressed for another life. Lucas stared at her for a few seconds, as if trying to preserve that image. He wanted to find the woman he loved there, but all he saw was someone who no longer looked at him with the same light. She grabbed her bag, took a deep breath, and said she wouldn't be long. He simply replied, too calmly, that she could go. That if she needed to go alone, perhaps she was already too accompanied. She froze. Her face drained of color, her eyes filled with something between guilt and denial. But she said nothing. She simply turned and left. And in that exact moment, Lucas understood that everything he feared was happening. Not because she confirmed it, but because the silence screamed louder than any explanation. He stood there for long minutes, staring at the closed door. Then he slowly went upstairs, entered the room, and sat on the edge of the bed. He stood there, motionless, feeling the weight of what had been left unsaid. The pain of suspicion turning into silent certainty. And his heart ached at the shattering of what had once seemed unshakable. He took out his phone and opened his gallery of old photos. Images of the two of them smiling in places that now seemed so distant. Short videos of trips, birthdays, simple dates. And in that contrast between the light past and the heavy present, emptiness settled in completely. For the first time in a long time, he felt alone within his own story. Isabella, for her part, wasn't exactly happy that night. She wore her smile like a well-practiced mask, spoke to everyone, moved around the room like someone who knew her place, but inside, something hurt. Ever since she left home, she'd carried the weight of the last sentence she'd heard. The sentence spoken without a shout, without accusation, but loaded with truth. It destabilized her more than any argument. She hadn't expected him to notice. Or, if he did, she hadn't expected him to speak. Lucas had always been restrained, always opted for harmony. But that sentence was like a mirror. And she didn't like what she saw reflected back. Even so, the evening continued. Empty conversations, toasts, laughter that didn't reach her eyes. And amidst the crowd, there was him, the man who had been occupying an ever-increasing space in her thoughts. A coworker, friendly, persuasive, always with the right word at the right time. Someone who made her feel desired, seen. And that, in recent months, was a rare sensation. They grew closer casually. Small compliments, shared lunches, confidences in the elevator. And before they knew it, there was a silent game between them. A tension. An almost exciting danger. And that night, they were finally alone, away from the tables and the cameras. All it took was a lingering look, a lingering touch on the arm, and everything that had been suspended materialized in a quick, hidden, but devastating kiss. Isabella didn't think about the consequences. Or maybe you did, but ignored them. She was there, with someone who made her feel something different, even if it was just the taste of the forbidden. She knew there was no love in that gesture. It was impulse. It was need. It was escape. But even so, he let it happen. Because on some level, she wanted to feel alive. She wanted to test the limits. She wanted to know how far she could go without breaking everything completely. Meanwhile, Lucas had left the house. He drove aimlessly, the radio off, his thoughts deafening. He stopped in front of a small square where they used to stroll during the first months of their relationship. He sat on a bench and stared into space. He thought about the possibilities, the signs he'd ignored, the blind faith he'd had for so long. He thought about how she'd been pulling away and how he tried to keep them together alone. And, above all, he thought about what he would do from now on. The feeling that had previously been only pain was now beginning to transform into a strange kind of liberation. Because, for the first time, he saw that perhaps their love was already over, and he just didn't want to accept it. Hours later, when Isabella returned home, she found everything in the same place. The lights were off, the kettle still on the stove, his shoes arranged neatly beside the sofa. She walked in slowly, guilt clinging to her skin, feeling dirty, confused, lost. She expected a confrontation, a question, some gesture. But no one was there. Lucas had left without warning. She stood in the living room, staring at her reflection in the window, her lipstick smeared and her eyes heavy. Everything seemed out of place, including her. Lucas didn't return until the next morning. He entered quietly. She was still asleep, or pretending to be. He showered, dressed, grabbed a few things, and left again. 2 days passed without any real conversation. Just exchanges of loose, necessary phrases. Until, one Tuesday night, he came into the living room, sat across from her, and said he needed some time. That he didn't want answers, or excuses. Just space. Isabella tried to argue, but the words tumbled in her throat. She wanted to say she was sorry, but she couldn't explain. Because, deep down, she herself didn't understand why she had allowed this to happen. Lucas moved into a small rented apartment. Sparse furniture, few things, but a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. In the silence of that new space, he began to reorganize not only his belongings, but also his own feelings. The first few weeks were difficult. Her absence hurt more than he cared to admit. But gradually, the pain gave way to understanding. He realized that perhaps their love hadn't ended overnight, but that the choice to keep it alive was no longer mutual. And without that, there was no way to continue. Isabella, on the other hand, sank into a sea of regret. She tried to move on with her life, but everything seemed gray. The days grew heavy, and her automatic gestures were now accompanied by memories. Every corner of the house bore traces of him. Every object seemed to remind her of what had been destroyed. She realized, too late, that the emotion of the moment had cost her something real. Something that, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't rebuild on her own. And it was in this emptiness that the penny dropped. She had betrayed not only his trust, but herself as well. But what she didn't yet know, what she never suspected, is that that night, while she was getting ready for the party, Lucas was also preparing something. A silent gesture, thought out with love and hope. Something that never came to pass. And the reason for it was never spoken aloud. Yet. 3 weeks had passed since their last conversation. There were no arguments, no shouting, just a silent and definitive separation. Lucas remained distant, busying himself with his new apartment, with new projects, trying to rebuild himself emotionally without allowing himself to sink into the pain of what he had lost. Isabella, meanwhile, immersed in an empty daily routine, felt the growing weight of regret. The bitter taste of the wrong choice mingled with the absence of the man who, for so long, had been her refuge. She avoided recalling the details of that night. Each time the memory surfaced, something inside her broke again. She tried to move on with life with a false sense of normalcy, but everything around her seemed to be slowly crumbling. Friends began to drift away, the work that once fulfilled her now seemed purposeless, and even the walls of the house seemed to judge her. The nights became long and suffocating, the days drawn out and too silent. Lucas didn't seek her out. He didn't respond to messages, didn't answer calls, didn't show any sign of wanting to relive what, for him, was already buried. Deep down, there was a pain still present, yes, but mixed with a stronger feeling, relief. Being away from her, as painful as it was, brought the clarity that you couldn't rebuild something alone. Trust, once broken, couldn't be restored. And he no longer wanted to live waiting for gestures, for attention, for crumbs of affection. He wanted someone who would choose him firmly. Someone without doubts. Someone who wouldn't trade him at the first turn of the routine. So, day after day, he rebuilt himself. He still wasn't sure where all this would lead, but he knew there was no turning back. And it was precisely at that moment, just as the wound began to heal, that the truth finally emerged. The secret that had been trapped in the past, forgotten under the weight of pride and pain, found a cruel and silent way to reveal itself. It happened on a cloudy afternoon, the kind when the sky seems to anticipate tragedy. Isabella was sorting through boxes of old objects, trying to empty the house that was slowly ceasing to be home. She needed a change, needed a breath of fresh air, perhaps a different city, perhaps a new beginning. While rummaging through the back of the closet, she found a sturdy, unmarked envelope among a stack of folders belonging to Lucas. Curious, she opened it without thinking. And there, her heart sank. Inside was a small, handwritten letter in her familiar handwriting, direct, emotional, sincere. It wasn't just any letter. It was a message of love. A declaration. A request. Beside the letter was a smaller, stiffer envelope with her name written in careful script. Inside, a ring. A new, elegant, delicate ring. It was a promise ring. Or rather, a new beginning. Lucas intended to renew his vows with her. That letter, that gesture, that symbol, everything had been planned for the very night of the party. The very night she chose to cheat. She felt her legs give out. She sat on the floor, limp, her eyes welling up as if the world had collapsed. Time stood still for a few seconds, as if the universe demanded she absorb every bit of that pain. He wasn't walking away simply because he was tired. He had tried. He was willing to fight. He believed in her. And she, destroyed everything. What she didn't know, until that moment, was that he had booked dinner at an elegant restaurant, prepared all night for that proposal. He'd hired a small band to play the live music that had accompanied their first kiss. He'd ordered flowers, chosen her favorite wine. He had everything ready. The plan was to wait for her to return from work, surprise her with an invitation, drive her there, and, at the end of the night, get down on one knee and tell her that, despite the difficulties, he still believed in them. It was his last attempt. The final gesture of someone who, even hurt, wanted to rebuild with the one he loved. But she never came back. At least, not to him. That night, she chose a different path. A path of no return. Isabella was now crying uncontrollably. It wasn't just guilt, but the knowledge that she had thrown away something many people spend their entire lives trying to find. A man who still believed, who still dreamed of a future together, even with the emotional distance that had already formed between them. She tried to get up, but felt suffocated, as if the weight of the letter were on her chest. She walked to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and stood there, staring into the void, trying to understand how she had gotten to this point. How she had allowed herself to give in to a fleeting need when she had a whole love before her. At that very moment, as if fate were enjoying the chaos it was creating, her phone vibrated with an unexpected message. It was Lucas. After weeks of silence, a short message, "Are you home?" Without thinking, she answered yes. He said he needed to pick up some boxes he'd left in the living room closet. He said he wouldn't be long. And she, trembling, knew it was her only chance to say something, anything, before he disappeared from her life forever. She ran to the mirror, tried to clean her face, to hide her swollen eyes, but there was no hiding anything anymore. Minutes later, the doorbell rang. When she opened the door, their eyes met. He was different. Thinner, more serious, with a look that blended peace and distance. He entered without formality. He greeted her with a slight wave and walked to the closet. Isabella followed him silently, unsure where to begin. Until, unable to contain her anxiety any longer, she spoke. He said he had found the letter. That he had read everything. That now he understood. Lucas continued rummaging through the boxes, not looking at her. He simply replied, in a firm voice, that it no longer mattered. But to her, it did. It was all that mattered. He began to cry. He said he felt horrible. That if she had known what he was planning, she would never have left that night. That she would never have gotten lost the way she did. That she felt ashamed, regretful, disgusted with herself. But Lucas, now, was no longer crying. He turned to her, took a deep breath, and said he'd tried. That he'd poured his heart into it that night. That he'd prepared every detail with hope. That he believed that if he could touch her heart with that gesture, perhaps there would still be time. But she wasn't there. She chose not to be. And that said more than any excuse could erase. He said that, as much as he still felt something, he could no longer trust. And that without trust, there is no love. Isabella tried to reach out, to touch him, but he backed away. He said that day, while waiting for her, sitting at a reserved table, with a ring in his pocket and a violin playing in the background, he realized he was alone. That the love he felt wasn't enough. Because loving alone isn't love. It's an illusion. She broke down. She tried every way to apologize. She said it had been a mistake, a weakness, that nothing compared to what they had. But Lucas didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just looked her in the eyes and said he forgave her. Not for her. But for him. Because he needed to move on in peace. And now, finally, he could. Isabella fell to her knees. She begged him to stay. To try again. To start from scratch. But Lucas had already broken inside. He grabbed the last box, stood up, and before leaving, said he'd waited for this moment. That he'd hoped, yes, for her to repent. To see what she'd lost. But now that it had happened, he realized he didn't want to go back. That forgiveness doesn't mean return. And with that, he closed the door. This time, forever. But something still remained, silent, kept with him since that night. A gesture she never knew existed. And that still waited to be revealed. Lucas left the apartment without looking back. Not because he was indifferent, but because he had already looked too much, inwardly. He had rummaged through every memory, every silence, every misinterpreted gesture, until he reached the certainty that there was no room for return. He was an exhausted man, but at peace. He walked the streets as if he had just buried something precious and heavy, something he had had to carry for too long. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle was beginning to fall, as if time, too, were crying out for relief. The city continued to live around him, indifferent to the end of a story that had once been an entire world. The taxi arrived quickly. He got in, gave the address of his new apartment, and sank into the seat, staring out the window. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just kept going. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel adrift. He was going somewhere. Even if he didn't yet know his final destination. Isabella remained on the living room floor for a long time after the door closed. He couldn't get up, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe properly. The letter was still open on the table, the ring beside it, intact. This vision consumed her. It was like looking at the most beautiful version of the life she destroyed with her own hands. The proposal that never came. The gesture that never happened. The chance you never had. Because she took it away. The clock read almost 9 o'clock when he finally stood up, his legs trembling, his throat dry. He went to the bathroom, washed his face, stared at the mirror with red eyes. And for the first time, he saw the woman he truly was. Not the image he sold to others, not the respected professional, not the perfect social media partner, but someone broken inside, by her own inability to value what mattered most. He ran his fingers along the mirror's frame as if searching for some trace of himself. And all he found was emptiness. The next day, she woke early, even though she hadn't slept much. She decided to go out, walk the streets, try to breathe. She ended up at the same cafe where they'd met years before. She entered slowly, as if invading a sacred space. The place was practically the same worn wooden chairs, the smell of fresh coffee, the low sound of jazz playing in the background. She chose the same table as the first time. She sat and stayed there, without ordering anything. Just remembering. Remembering the way he'd looked at her, with curiosity and tenderness. Remembering their first conversation, their first joke, their first touch. She felt small within that meaningful setting. And, once again, she understood what she'd lost. Lucas, on the other side of town, was going through a different process. He was slowly starting over. Not the kind you do in a rush, but with presence. He had returned to places he loved, reconnected with old friends, and reorganized his life. And, during one of these reunions, he ended up running into someone unexpected, Helena. A childhood friend he hadn't seen in over 10 years. The encounter happened by chance, in a local bookstore. She recognized him first. She called his name with a genuine smile, and he, surprised, smiled back. They sat down for coffee. They talked for hours. Helena was easygoing, direct, had a sharp wit, and a calmness that contrasted with everything he'd been carrying. There was no rush, no pressure, no hidden agendas. Just a simple exchange between two people who, for some reason, knew exactly what the other needed to hear. The days passed. Coffees turned into walks. Walks turned into dinners. And the dinners began to bring smiles Lucas didn't know he was still capable of. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was a beginning. A possibility. And that was already a lot for someone who had thought he'd never want anything again. Helena didn't ask about the past, didn't pressure him about the future. She was just there. Present. And that made him feel that, even with the wreckage he carried inside, there were still enough good parts to build something new. For the first time, he didn't feel guilty about being okay. He felt he deserved it. Isabella, on the other hand, sank deeper and deeper into absence. There were days when she didn't eat properly. She slept poorly, woke up with his name on her lips, and went about her daily routine like an actress forced to act out her own life. Work no longer fulfilled her. The messages from her lover had stopped weeks before. He had disappeared as soon as the emotion had faded, making it clear that none of it had any real value. And she now understood that what she had felt wasn't passion, it was escape. And every escape exacts its price. Hers was too high. One day, he decided to write. He grabbed an old notebook and began to write down everything he felt. He wrote about mistakes, fears, the pain of losing a true love. About how you traded something solid for an illusion. He wrote for hours. Pages filled with tears, blurring the ink. At the end, he wrote a final sentence, as if it were a sentence: I killed him with my silence. He closed the notebook and put it in the top drawer of his dresser. Not to show him, not anymore. But to never forget. Meanwhile, Lucas and Helena began seeing each other more often. They were already laughing at inside jokes, texting before bed, and sharing the small joys of the day. He was still young, still fragile, but he was honest. One afternoon, he took her to a special place, the restaurant where he had once waited for Isabella with a ring in his pocket. Helena didn't know the story. He simply commented that the place was beautiful. And, for the first time, Lucas was able to enter there without feeling pain. He felt gratitude. For having survived. For having closed cycles. For starting over, even without guarantees. A few weeks later, the two were walking through an outdoor market. Lucas stopped at a craft stall and looked at a small wooden box. He picked it up, opened it, and smiled. Helena asked what it was. He said that years ago, he had bought a similar box to store a ring that had never been delivered. She didn't answer. She just held his hand firmly. And in that gesture, there was more than words. On the other side of town, Isabella was passing by the same restaurant. She looked inside and, for a moment, thought she saw him. It was him. Sitting at a corner table, smiling. Beside him, a woman. Beautiful. Serene. He looked light. Happy. She didn't go in. She didn't dare. She stood there for seconds that felt like an eternity, until a tear fell. Not of anger. Nor of jealousy. But of loss. Because in that moment, she understood definitively that he was no longer hers. And that, perhaps, he would never again be anyone's as he once was. He returned home in silence. He made tea, sat on the sofa, and picked up the photo album. He looked at each image as if watching a movie from another time. A time when there was still a chance. He closed the album, lay down on the sofa, and stared at the ceiling. And there, in the midst of the absolute silence, he felt the most real pain of all, the knowledge that there is no going back when the one who left didn't leave any doors open. The following week, Lucas and Helena were in the park, sitting on the grass. He was telling a funny childhood story, and she laughed lightly. The sun was setting. He looked at her and suddenly fell silent. She noticed. She asked if everything was okay. He said yes. He said that for the first time in a long time, he felt peace. She smiled. She said she did too. And then he looked up at the sky and, without warning, murmured, "Thank you." She asked, "Why?" He replied, "For showing me that it's still worth being chosen." Meanwhile, Isabella, at home, reopened Lucas's letter. She read every line again. She held the ring in her hands. And wrote a new letter, without an addressee. At the end, she wrote, "I hope she loves you as I should have." She put it in the same envelope. And sealed it. There was no reconciliation. No redemption. Just the truth. Hard, raw, but liberating. He moved on. She stayed. And, in the end, it was fair. Because love that's betrayed dies, but love that's reborn, that's what blossoms again. And sometimes not with the person we imagined. But with the person who arrives at the right time. Without needing to prove anything. Just by staying. And even if they never meet again, there will be a day when she remembers him to the sound of an old song, and smiles sadly. And there will be a day when he remembers her, perhaps telling the story to a child or a friend, and says simply, "It was love. But it wasn't forever." And that will be enough. Because not all love needs to last to be real. Some loves only serve to teach us who we shouldn't lose. And when we lose them, they change us forever. The time that followed Lucas and Isabella's silent and definitive reunion was not immediate in its resolutions. There was no abrupt severing of memories, nor a complete liberation from what had once united them. What happened, in fact, was a gradual process, in which they both began to experience absence as a constant and uncomfortable presence, as an echo of everything they could have been but weren't. Lucas, even reconstructed in many layers, still had moments when he found himself immersed in an involuntary emptiness, as when he found forgotten objects among his things, a toothbrush, a handkerchief smelling of old perfume, a handwritten recipe for a dish only she knew how to make just the way he liked it. It wasn't longing for the relationship, but for the part of himself that had been molded by it and that now needed to learn to live without that connection. Helena, sensitive to Lucas's healing process, maintained her presence firmly, but without intrusion. There was a tacit respect for all he had lost, for all that was still silently healing. She didn't compete with the past, didn't demand explanations, she simply stayed. And her presence, over time, became more than comfort, it became a choice. A new kind of love, built not on the rubble of pain, but on the bricks laid patiently. Still, Lucas needed, from time to time, to grapple with the question that arose in moments of solitude: had he really done all he could for Isabella? This doubt, even without guilt, visited him like a whisper that insisted on returning, especially on silent nights when memory acts on its own. Meanwhile, on the other side of the once divided landscape, Isabella lived in a space that seemed frozen in time. She tried moving furniture around, redecorating rooms, donating objects, but none of these actions were enough to disassociate the place from the history she had lived. The walls held the sound of old laughter, and the bathroom mirror still reflected a face she no longer recognized. She felt torn between guilt and learning. She knew she had made a mistake, she knew she didn't deserve a second chance, but she also knew she wasn't the same woman who made that mistake. And that was the cruelest part, realizing she had changed too late. Amidst all this, she began to live with a kind of new consciousness, where every decision, every contact, was deeply analyzed, as if to ensure she would never again cause anyone the pain she had caused Lucas. The messages were never sent again. The attempts at rapprochement ceased. There was a mutual acceptance of the end, though the feelings hadn't been erased. Isabella began therapy, resumed old hobbies, and tried to find some meaning within herself before seeking it outside. But her once vibrant gaze now held a discreet melancholy, a depth that only those who have lost themselves and others can grasp. Some days, she wrote letters she hadn't intended to deliver. It was her way of communicating with the past, of saying things she'd kept inside, of transforming pain into words. And in one of these letters, she wrote something she couldn't forget: perhaps the greatest punishment isn't losing the one we love, but continuing to live afterward, with everything we learned too late. On Lucas's side, there was also an attempt to tread lightly. Helena, with her firm yet delicate presence, became his companion on weekends, on sunset walks, and on unpretentious Wednesday dinners. It was a different kind of love. Without the same fireworks, but with a stability he never knew he needed. Still, there was something Lucas needed to face alone: the fear of giving himself completely again. A lingering self-doubt, as if the previous failure had left invisible scars that still hurt. There were times when he would pull away, not for lack of love, but for protection. And Helena, realizing this, respected it. But she also challenged him, urging him to look forward without carrying the shadow of what had passed. One of those quiet afternoons, as they walked through an art museum, Helena stopped before an abstract painting and said something that stayed with him for days. She said, "Some things don't need to be understood to be felt. The past is one of them." Lucas was silent at the time, but the phrase resonated within him. Because, in a way, he was still trying to find logic in the pain, an explanation for the events that separated them. And perhaps it was time to accept that life doesn't answer all questions. Sometimes, it just moves on. And it's up to us to decide whether we move on too. Isabella, on the other hand, had an unexpected conversation with her mother, who didn't know everything that had happened. During lunch, in the midst of small talk, her mother commented on how special Lucas always seemed, and how she missed the lightness Isabella had when she was with him. That sentence was like a punch in the gut. There was no judgment, just observation. But it was enough to make Isabella burst into tears right there, unable to contain it. For the first time, she told everything: details, motivations, regrets. Her mother listened without interrupting, her eyes brimming with tears. When Isabella finished, she expected to hear some consolation, some sentence that would ease the weight she carried. But all she heard was, "What hurts the most is seeing that you only discovered his value after losing him." That conversation left her silent for days. She considered writing to Lucas again, not to apologize, nor to try to win him back, but simply to thank him. Thank him for loving her when she wasn't even sure she loved herself. Thank him for being patient, for believing, for leaving a love that, even broken, never turned to hate. But she decided not to send it. She understood that sometimes, the greatest act of love we can offer is to not interrupt the peace someone else has found without us. As the months passed, life began to fall into place. Helena and Lucas were already making small plans, a short trip, a move, a new project together. It wasn't rushing, it was maturity. He now knew the value of building himself slowly, with presence, with truth. And he felt that, with her, he didn't need to prove anything. He could just be. And that was enough. One day, while walking through an antiques fair, he found an aged wooden frame, the kind that seems to carry stories in its details. He bought it without much thought. At home, he placed inside a photo he'd recently taken with Helena, the two of them smiling, embraced, facing some random landscape. And he placed the frame on the shelf, as if silently declaring that he was ready to live again. Isabella, for her part, continued her routine of reconstruction. She moved apartments, starting over in a different neighborhood, where nothing resembled what she'd experienced. It was difficult, lonely, but necessary. She no longer wanted to repeat patterns or hide behind excuses. She accepted her mistakes as part of her history, but not as her identity. And, one Sunday afternoon, she decided to visit an art exhibition alone. She walked calmly among the paintings and sculptures, as if seeking to understand the world from new perspectives. In one of the hallways, she stopped in front of an installation that spoke about time and its absences. And there, she wept quietly. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of pain that had already transformed into learning. Not all endings require reunions. Not all lost loves need to be rekindled to prove they were real. Sometimes, life presents us with choices that cost us more than we imagine. And when we realize it, it's too late. What remains, then, is the lesson. And that, if learned, has the power to transform everything that follows. Lucas, today, no longer feels anger. Nor pain. Only memory. Isabella no longer feels despair. Only longing for what can no longer be. And in this contrast, there is justice. There is balance. Because, in the end, betrayal didn't just take a relationship. It took the version of them that existed when they were still together. And that, however beautiful it once was, will not return. But there's still one last choice to be made. And that one will change everything. Isabella decided to travel alone. For the first time in years, she packed her bags without consulting anyone, choosing a destination she hadn't planned, a small lakeside town, surrounded by mountains and silence. She needed to escape the scene where it all happened, the stage where she herself had become her antagonist. It was no longer about trying to forget Lucas, she knew that would be impossible, but about learning to live with the fact that, even with regret, even transformed, there was no way back. She rented a simple cottage, began frequenting local cafes, reading books that had been sitting for years, writing in old notebooks, and spent hours watching the reflection of the clouds on the lake's surface. No one there knew her name, her story, her past. And so, for the first time since, she felt free to simply exist. She was no longer the woman who cheated, no longer Lucas's ex. She was simply a woman trying to find herself amidst the emotional ruins she carried with dignity. One Saturday morning, sitting on a wooden bench, she spotted an elderly couple holding hands, walking along the lakeshore. They walked slowly, as if time was in no hurry to end. The man stopped, adjusted the scarf that had fallen from the woman's shoulder, and she smiled tenderly. Isabella observed the scene as if gazing at something sacred. There was a simplicity there that eluded her. It wasn't about grand gestures, but about permanence. About caring even after so long. And it was there, on that bench, that he realized it was never about what Lucas did or didn't do. It was always about how she allowed the spark to fade within herself. She hadn't betrayed him for lack of love, but because she didn't know what to do with the love that still existed. It was a hard confession to accept, but a necessary one. That same afternoon, she wrote another letter, but didn't keep it with the others. She burned it. She watched each word turn to ash, as if ending a version of herself that no longer had a place in her story. Meanwhile, Lucas had accepted a job offer in another city. A challenging project that would require weeks away. Helen encouraged him. She said she trusted him, that this was a chance to expand, to reconnect with the part of him that had always loved creating. She wasn't the kind of woman to make demands. She preferred to listen, observe, and walk alongside. Lucas admired this in her, this sense of partnership that didn't suffocate. He accepted the offer. He traveled. And in the first few days, between meetings, sketches, and new ideas, he felt energized. It was as if this new setting had opened doors that had been locked inside him. She began keeping a personal journal, something she had never done before. She recorded not only facts, but also feelings, reflections, questions that still lacked answers. On one page, she wrote, "The freedom I found didn't come from the absence of pain, but from the acceptance that what ended really needed to end." During one of those nights in the new city, he sat in a quiet bar. A local singer played guitar and vocals, old songs, some Lucas recognized from his time with Isabella. He felt no pain. He felt something deeper, compassion. For her, for himself, for everything they'd been through and couldn't bear. He picked up his phone, opened his old photo gallery, and saw a picture of the two of them smiling on the balcony of their old apartment, each with a glass of wine, and a look of tranquility. He deleted the photo. Not out of spite. But because it was no longer his. That moment, that time, that version of himself, was gone. He needed space for new records, for new memories. Helena continued her life in parallel. When Lucas returned on the weekends, they spent the evenings talking about everything and nothing, cooking together, listening to old records. They didn't talk much about Lucas's past, and she didn't share hers either. They had made a silent pact to live in the present, without letting past stories contaminate the present. But there was a point of tension Helena felt, something unresolved, something Lucas might not even know how to name. And it was on a night when it was raining heavily outside that she decided to ask, looking directly into his eyes. She asked if he still loved Isabella. He took a while to answer. He said that love sometimes changes form, but it remains love. That there was no hatred, no desire for return, only respect and memory. Helena listened, silently. She replied only that she wasn't afraid of his past, but needed to know if her present was enough. Lucas held her hand and replied that he had never felt such peace with anyone. And in that gesture, Helena believed. Meanwhile, in the small town where she had taken refuge, Isabella decided to return. Not by impulse, but by choice. She had already done what she needed to do there. She was ready to face the city where she had made mistakes, where she had been judged, where she had fallen apart. Back in her apartment, she found everything in its place, but nothing the same. She began redecorating, no longer to hide memories, but to give the space new meaning. She removed paintings from the wall, painted one of them a new color, donated clothes and books. She made room. She decided to return to work at a new company, smaller, more humane, where she could start over without having to explain her past. Little by little, she began rebuilding a quiet, discreet, yet wholesome life. She joined a volunteer group on Saturdays, helping women in emotional crisis. There, she found a meaning she hadn't expected. Not to redeem herself, but to offer other women the chance to avoid making the same mistakes. On one of these volunteer afternoons, she heard a young woman tell her story of betrayal and regret. At the end, the young woman asked, "Do you think anyone deserves forgiveness after making so many mistakes?" Isabella replied, her eyes brimming with tears, "I don't know if we do. But we need it to keep living." It was the first time she had spoken out loud, to strangers, about something that had been bottled up inside her for so long. And in that moment, something healed. Not completely, but enough to move forward without the crushing weight of guilt. Lucas, for his part, completed the project and returned home. He was different. Lighter, more mature. He brought with him new ideas, different plans. And with Helena, he decided to visit a coastal town for vacation. There, between sunny days and walks on the sand, he asked her to help him write a book about emotional architecture, the idea that the spaces we inhabit also transform us. It was a project he'd always had but never had the courage to start. Now, with her, he felt ready. Helena smiled, said yes, and in that yes, Lucas felt that, this time, he was building something that could last. Not because it would be perfect, but because it would be true. Isabella, at home, received an envelope in the mail. It was a handwritten letter from one of the young women she had helped with the group. It read, "You showed me that it's possible to survive a mistake. Thank you for not pretending to be perfect." Isabella cried as she read it. It was the first time since everything that she felt useful again. She felt that, even without regaining the love she lost, she had found another kind of love, the one we give to the world when we decide not to repeat our own mistakes. They both moved on. In different ways, on paths that never crossed again. But there was a silent bond between them, not of attachment, but of transformation. The kind of bond that only develops between two people who, even after falling, manage to rise. And now, fate prepared the final choice. One neither of them expected, and one that would forever change the way they would look back on everything they had experienced. Months passed, and the cycle of life, as always, followed its merciless course. Lucas and Helena were closer than ever. Travel had become part of their routine, the book they were writing together was taking shape, and the spaces that once served as refuge from their pain were now transformed into places of creation, of new meanings. Lucas was different, but not in the sense of someone who had changed to please someone. He had changed because he had finally reconnected with what was essential. He had learned that it wasn't enough to be good to someone, you had to be whole. And now he was. One day, while visiting an architecture school for a lecture, he was surprised by a student who, during the questioning, asked him if he believed a space could bear the marks of an unresolved story. He smiled, answered yes, and added that sometimes the best way to give new meaning to a space is to simply move the walls and let light in where there had been shadows. And he spoke of architecture, but he was speaking of himself. Helena, in turn, was a rare balance between firmness and serenity. She never asked to be the center of Lucas's life, but he chose to place her there, and that made all the difference. One simple evening, after a home-cooked dinner and cheap wine, sitting on the porch with a blanket shared between them, Lucas held her hand and calmly told her he wanted to grow old with her, building something light, honest, and possible. She didn't cry, didn't make a fuss, simply responded with a lingering kiss. And there, in that silent gesture, they sealed something stronger than any hurried vow. It was a silent commitment, but a true one. Isabella followed suit. She was more sober in her choices, more selective in her connections, more aware of the impact of her own actions. The support group she belonged to now relied on her as a mentor. Other women were inspired by her journey not because she had overcome pain, but because she had learned to walk with it. One afternoon, as she was leaving a session with a new participant, she received an unexpected call. It was Lucas's father. He had found an old letter from her, forgotten in one of the boxes Lucas had left in the family's old house. He said he didn't want to cause any discomfort, but felt she should know the letter had been read. Isabella was silent for a moment. She asked if he had been disappointed in her. On the other end of the line, her father replied that it wasn't his place to judge, but that he hoped she would find peace, because carrying regret was too cruel a sentence. The call was brief, but it left Isabella with a bittersweet sense of closure. Not everything needed open forgiveness to be over. Some stories just needed to be closed with dignity. One cloudy morning, Isabella went for a walk and ran into Lucas's sister by chance. The conversation was awkward at first, but after a few minutes, the stiffness eased. They sat on a bench, talking about simple things, until Lucas's sister, with unexpected sincerity, said she still missed the woman Isabella used to be. Isabella swallowed hard and replied that she did too. But now, she was trying to be a new version. Perhaps lonelier, but more just. Her sister smiled and said that life is hard indeed, and that what we feel isn't always enough to keep someone close. When they said goodbye, there was a brief but sincere hug. And in that simple gesture, Isabella felt that, somehow, part of the circle was closing. Lucas and Helena traveled to launch their book together. The work was about healing spaces, both physical and emotional. In one of the interviews, the journalist asked if the book was autobiographical. Lucas looked at Helena and, with a half-smile, replied that all projects have a bit of the person who built them. But this one, in particular, was a way to show that you don't have to destroy everything to start over. Sometimes, you just need to know where it's still worth investing. The book was well received, became a reference at several universities, and brought them not only recognition but a sense of mission accomplished. A few months later, near the end of the year, Lucas received a letter. There was no sender, but he recognized the handwriting. It was from Isabella. She asked for nothing. No apology, no return, no attention. It was simply a farewell letter. In it, she said she now understood that their love had been real, but that the mistake had been too. And that not all love survives mistakes. He said he now understood that fidelity isn't just about what one does with the body, but about absence, silence, and invisible choices. And that she hadn't been faithful to their story. The letter ended with a thank you for existing in her life, for loving her when she didn't even know how to love herself, and for leaving when she most deserved to be alone. Lucas read it in silence, sealed the envelope, and put it away. He felt no anger, no pain. He felt respect. Because finally, everything had been said. And now, yes, I could move on in peace, without any loose ends. At the end of that year, Isabella decided to do something symbolic. She climbed to the top of a lookout point where she often went with Lucas, and there, alone, with the cold wind touching her face, she opened the diary where she had written so much over the past few months. She read a few passages quietly, and then left the diary there. Not as a form of abandonment, but as a surrender. It was her way of letting go of the past. As she descended, he felt lighter. As if, for the first time, she was ready to live without carrying the weight of what she had lost. Lucas and Helena, on New Year's Eve, stood on a deserted beach, holding hands, watching the fireworks in the distance. She rested her head on his shoulder and asked what he wanted for the new year. He replied that he didn't want promises, just continuity. That what they had was enough. And in that moment, with his bare feet in the cool sand and his heart at peace, Lucas knew he had arrived. Not at the final destination, but at the place where it no longer hurt. And that, after all, was more than he had dared to dream. Comment below what you thought of this story, if any part touched you, if you've experienced something similar, or if you know someone who has. Your opinion is very important to us and helps this channel continue telling stories like this. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and like this video. This really helps spread these messages and keep this space alive. This story leaves us with a clear and painful reflection: betrayal destroys much more than a relationship. It breaks invisible bonds, destroys happy memories, and erases possible futures. Betrayal is often not just physical. It's neglect, absence, the repeated choice not to be there. When you betray someone who loves you, you don't just lose them, you lose the version of them that was capable of loving you unconditionally. And that, once lost, never returns. And finally, once again, we reinforce that this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our stories exist to show the real, human, and painful consequences of the wrong decisions we make in relationships. May they serve as a warning, reflection, and transformation. Thanks for listening this far. See you in the next story.